Our sector is experiencing pressures from both ends of the entry status continuum, as I'm calling it, with highly educated, official language proficient immigrants requiring arguably fewer and different services, as well as different ways of accessing those services, and the increasing numbers of migrant and temporary residents who require interventions and services that we are only now beginning to understand, and who face systemic barriers to services primarily because the agencies with the capacity to deliver those services are constrained by government contribution agreements which set out restrictive eligibility criteria and rules. We were very pleased at OCASI to have this part of the report focus on refugee, migrant, and temporary residents and the connections between their entry status and the settlement and integration journey. And while we have a growing body of research on refugees, I would say, Jennifer, we have far less in terms of migrant workers and temporary residents, including our international students, and what their settlement trajectory looks like. Political and policy work with migrant and temporary residents has been happening on the ground from the beginning, with the work being led primarily by labor and workers' rights activists and community organizers. It is only in the last decade or so, I would argue, that the mainstream settlement and integration sector has woken up to how tragically underserviced these communities are, and that their service needs are poorly understood or responded to. And as I said earlier, the response of these service agencies have not been as robust as required or expected. And while we all understand the funding and contractual pressures agencies are increasingly, agencies, I believe, have to come to an understanding that there are small p political and policy choices they must make in the execution of their mission and mandates. And I stand here as your umbrella organization saying this, recognizing the real and legitimate pressures that you feel in terms of some of the pressures that you're under in who it is that you provide services to, given that funding, ongoing funding is often used to hold organizations to account. But I do think as sector leaders, you do need to make some of the hard choices in terms of being responsive to the needs that are appearing in the communities where you are located. I must say here that refugee service providers has been at the forefront of responding to the needs of temporary and migrant residents. The expertise that they developed working with refugee claimants in particular over these many decades has been invaluable in the movement for migrant workers and temporary residents' rights, particularly in accessing services. Not unexpected, but a shame, is that these agencies that have stepped up to fill the service gaps experienced by marginalized groups are very poorly funded. They beg and they barter, and through sheer creative genius, and this is your answer, Jennifer, in terms of how it is that we're seeing more complex cases of government-assisted refugees, yet their economic and social outcomes after many years tends to be on par with other entry status groups, is because these agencies, they barter, they beg, and through sheer creative genius, are able to provide the services that they do, and also to punch above their policy weight. And I'll come back to that in a minute when I talk later on about some of the wins that we've been seeing in the sector. It is the effective advocacy and policy work of these refugee service providers in partnerships with workers' rights and labor organizations, community activists and organizers that have brought organizations like OCASI and many of its members, and much later, governments like Toronto and Hamilton, and the provincial government's Ministry of Citizenship, Immigration and International Trade, and the Provincial Ministry of Labor, along in our understanding of the issues faced by temporary and migrant workers. The service provider advocate activist partnerships have been in the forefront of crafting effective responses to some of the concerns of migrant and temporary residents. We cannot discuss the changing demographics of service users, of course, without first pointing to changes in our immigration and refugee determination system, and John alluded to some of this as well as Philip in the discussions. New projections for newcomer numbers released for 2015 is at the highest since 2010. We're looking at 280,000, with the emphasis on the highly skilled and educated. And you saw the breakdown. I don't remember whose presentation showed the difference between pre-IRPA and, sorry, IRPA and the new Express Entry program. Philip, was that you? And you can see where the emphasis has changed, with a job offer clearly being the determining factor in the amount of points that you get, and then who gets creamed off the top with our new Express Entry system, which is a whole other conversation that we can have in terms of where it is that we're moving Canada's immigration program. But as I said, we're expecting the highest numbers for 2015. The temporary selection programs will continue with comparable numbers from previous years. And this year, in 2015, we'll see the first round of temporary foreign workers in the low-scale pilot project reach the end of their contracts based on the 4 years in, 4 years out rule. Many in the service sector and social justice movements believe that many of these temporary residents will choose to remain in Canada and will gravitate to large urban centers where there are services and diverse established ethno-racial communities, and even more important, where there are more opportunities for work in the underground economy. The wisdom on the ground is that we will see an increasing number of temporary and migrant residents moving out of status. At the same time that we're seeing this shift in terms of those here with a work permit moving out of status, we are seeing a decreasing number in entries under the family class. As I said, our immigration system is being skewed to economic class, and the numbers of refugee claimants has fallen at an alarming rate, and Jennifer's research is saying 49%. Government and privately sponsored refugee numbers continue to lag behind projections. So while our numbers are at 75,000, we're certainly not bringing in that number. And with the new announcement of 10,000 new Syrians and an additional 3,000 Iraqis, there are no details attached to that. 60%, according to the government, will be sponsored through private sponsorship agreement holders. No one is yet being clear with sponsorship agreement holders in terms of how that is really going to work, what processes are going to be in place, what kinds of supports the government will be putting in place. Sponsorship agreement holders are telling us that it costs $12,000 to $15,000 per year per person to bring in someone in Canada and to support them through their first year of settlement. So a hell of a lot of money, and what we're seeing is that we have a dwindling number of folks who are wanting to be part of the sponsorship program because they've been in a hurry up and wait mode for many years now as numbers continue to lag and the government continues to change rules and policies around them. So we are very much concerned about the numbers that we're bringing in terms of government-assisted and privately sponsored refugees, as well as the significant decrease in asylum seekers based on our new immigration and refugee determination rules, especially the change to refugee determination system. So the ongoing emphasis that we see and the work happening in shaping our system, our immigration system, into a labor market tool only with a little space for our humanitarian obligations indicates an ongoing growth, we believe, in an underclass and their marginality, unless that there is some form of intervention to mitigate the impact of national immigration policies. So let me briefly talk about some of the wins that we've been seeing. Organizations like the UFCW, which is a union, Justica, Migrante, Workers' Action Center, and Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, along with the immigrant and refugee serving sector allies like OCASI and some of our member agencies, has had some significant policy wins over the last 5 years. At the provincial level, the Ministry of Labor responded with legislative changes, including Bill 18, which is called the Stronger Workplaces for a Stronger Economy Act, which received royal assent last November. This new law, among other things, extends expanded protection to all migrant workers, including protection from recruiter fees, employers' downloading of costs, and protection from reprisals from recruiters. And this last actually has not yet been implemented, but will be in place by November of this year. The then Ministry of Citizenship and Immigration increased its budget last year for newcomer settlement programming by $1 million and extended formally for the first time funding to agencies working with refugee claimants or asylum seekers. Since that time, the ministry has also been publicly explicit in its support for services to temporary workers and international students. And whenever I talk about that, the next argument that folks usually make then is to say, well, given that the province realizes that services should be based on need, certainly provincial dollars can be used to serve those without full immigration status. But I think it is instructive that we pay attention to the fact that the province has shied away from any public acknowledgement that its funding dollars may be used for services to those with less than full immigration status, to what some of us call non-status folks here in Ontario. And our sense is that is clearly for political reasons and a fear of a backlash in terms of the province being seen to be providing dollars for services for folks who are illegal in Canada. And it's a concern both in terms of their relationship with the federal government, but also their relationship with the public. Oops. Okay, she's making go fast. Bill 49, the new provincial immigration bill, which is currently before the House, and which we support as the provincial council. We believe it missed an opportunity, however, to strengthen oversight on recruiters and employers who work with temporary workers. And while we were successful in getting them to introduce a registry for employees and recruiters, is voluntary as opposed to mandatory. And so that's one of the areas we will be debating once the bill gets to committee. The work at the municipal level, there's been some great wins there, has focused on access to services, everything from public health to policing, and a broad coalition of community activists and organizers, some of you here in the room, service agencies and advocacy and policy bodies like OCASI, with the support of many progressive city councillors, both here in Toronto and in Hamilton, have adopted motions that will extend city-funded services to all those who live in the cities, irrespective of immigration status. This move is meaningful for all residents without full status, but particularly for women, who often find themselves trapped in violent situations, both in the home and in the workplace, and often can't leave because of their fear of deportation if they ask for help, particularly if it's a policing matter. And while critical services like social housing, childcare, and to a large extent education are outside the jurisdictional responsibility of municipalities, the adoption of access without fear policies, as it's called here in Toronto, go a long way to alleviating some of the fear, as well as it reduces some of the deprivation experienced by those who live on the margins. So before I get kicked off of the stage, there are a number of areas I think we need to focus on in terms of policy moving forward. Certainly to continue the work that the municipalities have been doing across the province. We need more and more municipalities to become sanctuary cities, for lack of a better term. But we also need to turn our attention to the province in terms of doing some advocacy so that they formally begin to open up spaces in terms of residents, those who are residents in Ontario, having access to provincially funded programs as well, including things like social housing. But coming back to the sector, there are two key issues I think we need to pay attention to, and those are the questions that surfaced in a couple of the domains that were looked at. The first is around service eligibility. I think service eligibility for citizenship and immigration funded services is the key barrier to successful integration for immigrants and refugees in Canada. Citizenship in the federal government has the largest program. There is $296 million of CIC dollars that is spent for resettlement in Ontario. Compare that to about $7 million at the provincial government. So you can see the difference in scale. And unfortunately, the federal government dollars are restrictive. The contribution agreements, the accountability framework is onerous. John talked a bit about that in terms of there being lots of work that we need to do. But eligibility and opening up eligibility is probably the biggest piece of advocacy work that we need to do. A year ago, we were absolutely excited. We thought there was a window of opportunity, and actually the sector nationally made a politically strategic decision that we were going to go for the window of opportunity. So we actually dropped, for the last 2 years, advocacy on opening up services to asylum seekers as a way to get international students and temporary foreign workers through, because we thought that was more politically palatable. Royal Bank happened, backlash against TFW, everything came off the table, the conversation starts. So I am proposing that we drop that strategy, it's not getting us anywhere, and we return to the fact, to our principle that all services should be based on need and not on immigration status, regardless of where the funding is coming from, provincially or federally. And I know that there is a political chill right now, but I do think we need to continue to raise those conversations at all of the tables where we are, federally and provincially, and certainly at the municipal level. The second program and policy priority, of course, is funding. Who is funded, how they are funded, the accountability frameworks in place, how we measure outcomes, the impact of various interventions and programs are all up for discussion. The National Settlement Council, which is a joint policy table of the federal government and the sector umbrella organizations with provinces and territories around the table as well, have been having many of these conversations. And I must say, for the most part, the senior bureaucracy at national headquarters in Ottawa is very much on side. It's the very same thing here in Ontario. The province is wanting to have a conversation about how best to spend good dollars. I think John talked about it, that there are some changes that we can make without talking about increasing dollars. It's about how it is that we fund the organization, the kind of flexibility we allow in the funding that they receive, how it is that we come and work together to measure outcomes, how we reach agreement on what successes are. And I must say that while there are huge gaps between the sector and the government in coming to some sort of solutions around some of these issues, we also need to have that conversation intersectorally, because we're not all on the same page as a national sector. In Ontario, we see funding very differently than some of our folks across the country, particularly with umbrella groups and the role of umbrella groups in terms of advocacy as opposed to paying attention to issues of service. So lots of work to do, but we are thrilled that this research project has really surfaced some of the critical questions we need to be asking ourselves and we need to be paying attention to, and some of the questions that should be forcing those of us who provide services to be really looking to see if we're paying attention to the changing demographics of those who are coming in, the changing program needs of those who are coming in, and the kinds of program review and changes we need to make in the interventions and services we are providing on the ground. Thank you, and I'm sorry.